Now, I call upon James Ball to continue the case for side proposition.
Thank you, Mr. President. It's a pleasure to be here, and I suppose I should start by apologising for having my mobile phone out. I don't actually have any notes on it. I'm just a millennial, and I don't want to miss a tweet. It's genuinely a pleasure to be here before we hit the fourth lockdown, but I do think there's perhaps a victory in that it does mean that finally the eternal debate about this university degree is only the second most toxic PPE debate in the UK right now. So we are making some progress. Now, when the Oxford Union invited me to sort of participate in this debate, I will admit I immediately jumped to saying yes. Not least because there is nothing that PPE graduates like doing more than debating PPE, as told by the fact that 5 of the 6 speakers here tonight are PPEists, and the only person who isn't did SPS, which is, Cambridge's pale imitation. Sometimes you've got to play to the galley, sorry. But also, I was particularly pleased because I actually wrote a book on this. And it was a book that actually cited work done by Bronwyn's excellent Institute for Government about the curse of generalists in British society and claiming that PPE fed that. I should say, I haven't recently broken up with anyone who did PPE, and I've had far more sense than to date someone who did it. So I thought, they know about this book I wrote, Bluffocracy. They'll be asking me to speak in a proposition. Oh no. Someone had just found I studied PPE and assumed I'd quite like to oppose the motion. And in a fit of awkwardness, I sent a reply going, well, I've written publicly on this, several essays of the sort Bronwyn rejected, and a book. So I'd rather be on proposition. But I don't mind doing opposition if you need. And if that's not the problem with PPE, I don't know what is. It is a degree that teaches you to argue well about anything, whether you believe it or not. And that may not be what was intended when it was started. It may have had noble causes. But the nature of the degree, the nature of the people who study it, mean that that's inevitable. PPE corrupts. And this is because, essentially, I think 101 years ago, I am not willing to do the PPE gloss. This was started not 100 years ago. 101 years ago, someone seems, in my head, to have heard the phrase, a little knowledge is a dangerous thing, and gone, great, let's set that up then. PPE gives you essentially microdoses of 3 huge topics you could spend a lifetime learning, and goes, yeah, you could do all 3 of those in 3 years, sure. Why not? Tell you what as well, let's make the lectures optional too. You don't need those. And there are problems with that. It makes it very easy for you to think that you know things that you don't, especially to those of you who quit economics in the first year. Because the way economics works is the first year you learn how it's supposed to work if everything was perfect. Every year of study you do after that tells you why it doesn't work like that. This is why anyone who took Economics 101 in the US is a much, much bigger idiot than someone who hasn't studied it at all. And so what PPE does is give you a way to have economics on your degree when you took 2 terms of classes, didn't really pay attention and got 40% in prelims. That's not ideal. What's particularly bad is if you are someone with Dunning-Kruger and then think you actually know about economics. This is just as dangerous for politics or philosophy. It gives you a way to think that you know a field when you don't. To be actually academically qualified to study any of these, normally, you would do a 3-year undergrad, a 1 or 2 year master's, and at least 4 years on a PhD. You might be looking at 7 years to 10 years to actually be an expert in these fields. PPE gives those of us who are hubristic or arrogant enough to do it, I know what I need. I've got the Spark notes. I don't want to be an egghead about it. And that doesn't help. If you don't think that feeds into the generalism problem that the IFG do such brilliant work feeding, then, I have a bridge to sell you, and I'm pretty confident I could do it. I studied economics, And so it's that faking and that stepping over that is intrinsically difficult about PPE. Its broadness isn't a strength. Its broadness is its fatal flaw, and the attitude it gives you feeds through. And that's made all the worse by the tutorial system. Let us acknowledge Oxford academics who teach PPE are among the best in their fields in the world. I am very, very grateful to my tutors who were brilliant and probably don't really love that I publicly dunk on their degree every year or two. But, as was hinted here by our Honourable President, Oxford academics hate PPE. If you get them talking about it, they do not like teaching this because, especially for philosophy and politics, there is a way to get through a tutorial. One route is to thoroughly read and digest the topic, to think about it, to challenge yourself, to go beyond the reading list and really put the work in. So obviously only about 20% of students do that. The rest understand that if you are not reading that week, the trick is to absolutely savage whoever is. And such was the case of this, that I lived with someone who I tutored with for 2 terms, and we had a rule that what happened in tutorials stayed in tutorials, and we would both avoid the house for 6 hours after a tutorial because we couldn't even look at each other. But this teaches you a lot of skills that help you in British public life. We like fast talkers, we like people who are funny, we like people who can turn an argument on its head. That doesn't really help you when you need things. You know, people like Nate Silver, who is not to my knowledge a PPEist, like to talk about the very old classical illusion of the fox and the hedgehog. The fox knows many things, but the hedgehog knows one big thing. And lots of research has shown actually foxes are least likely to be wrong as pundits. They're quite good at predicting things, whereas hedgehogs with deep knowledge of one area or one deep, firmly held view are looked on as utterly inferior by Nate's analysis. It sort of misses that in many versions of that story, the original doesn't survive, it's only a fragment. The fox dies because the hedgehog knows how not to get eaten by a fox, and the fox starves. And so what it tells you is one of them isn't the winning strategy. We value generalists far too much. We have this awful quote by Winston Churchill, who I'm told donated this box that my phone is sitting on, that experts should be on tap but not on top. That culture can only come from people who want you to value generalism, who can come from the pyramid and the food chain that PPE starts. If you are cursed with knowing about your subject matter, your civil service career is still limited. It's not as bad as it used to be, but it's there. PPE is the intake for that flow. You do not need to think about the diversity problems, about the historical sort, about the course content to see the problem. We don't need to can every generalist. It does need some of us. I think, every PPEist in this room could be employed in public life if we just restricted the supply afterwards. We're not asking anyone to sacrifice their career here, but we need a mix, and PPE tips the scales in a horrible way against us. Bronwyn's very reasonable question was, what's the alternative? I do suggest there's one in the name. Philosophy is a perfectly proud and deep subject. Politics is a perfectly proud and deep subject. And economics, much maligned though it is a perfectly proud and deep subject. Why don't we acknowledge that maybe there's enough in each of them that it could survive being a 3-year course on its own? We might not exhaust the entire field. And so, my only thing to close is, I am aware that our side of this debate is facing something of a disadvantage in that the people who are going to come to a PPE debate are probably largely PPEists. So I will only offer up this. It is often said of PPEists that we are the kind of person who will follow you into a revolving door and come out first. We're known as being self-serving, we're known as being glib, we're known as being venal and out for getting to the top. If you vote in opposition to this motion, you will confirm everything that people think about us. If you vote in proposition, you will show us as the aspiring public servants that we wish to be. And with that, I thank you.